So with this introduction to why innovation is so important in companies, let's talk about some of the realities of innovation in companies. A guy that was very influential in thinking about entrepreneurship and writing about it, and there's actually a short reference to him in the textbook, named Joseph Schumpeter, wrote back in the 1930s or so that he was afraid that entrepreneurship would ultimately result in there only being a few corporations in the world that would control everything. And the reason he said that is because corporations are fundamentally advantaged when it comes to the idea of business entrepreneurship. And the reason that he said that is, and very logical reasons. First of all, they have lots of relevant industry experience. And that's one of the things that's proven to lead to successful entrepreneurship is typically people know something about the industry in which they're trying to innovate. Secondly, they have users. This helps both with customer adoption. It's easier to sell something or to sell something to people who are already buying something from you. Plus, you get a lot of feedback from users. They tell you what they like and don't like about your product, and so that's a tremendous advantage. And very importantly, corporations, particularly bigger corporations, have the resources to do two things. One, they have the resources to pursue these new ideas because sometimes it's very expensive to do so. And equally important, they have the resources to be able to withstand the failures that are a necessary consequence of trying to do new things. So, because of this, Schumpeter said eventually only big companies will survive because they're the only ones that will be able to innovate. As logical as that argument is, it's wrong. Here's why it hasn't proven to be the case. First of all, and I want to emphasize this again, successful innovation is hard, particularly of the sort that I'll describe, we'll dive into more later. You hear only about the small companies that succeed and get big. You don't hear about all the small companies that were all trying to do the same thing and failed. Uber wasn't the first person to try to do ride sharing. Virtually all the companies you hear about, it's not like they were the only ones who tried, they were the only ones who succeeded. So it's hard. Beyond that general term, companies have a really hard time of killing their own successful products. In other words, they are not motivated to innovate when what they have is working very well in the marketplace, and especially when it's making a lot of money. And I'll give you, we'll talk about Amazon more later, but I'll give you a company that is a really bright exception to this, and that was Netflix. Netflix had a very successful business that was based on shipping DVDs to and from customers as people watch movies off of DVDs. Great business. And they were the ones that pioneered streaming. It is just not very common. You see a company take something where they had tremendous resources, distribution hubs, and all these DVDs and render them worthless through the streaming business. I would say if you're familiar today with all the problems associated with the 737 MAX, that was because Boeing was unwilling to kill their cash cow and they tried to do too much with an airplane that it was just time to go to a whole new design. A huge, huge, huge factor is the fact that of internal politics. Here's the deal. In a company, when you're proposing this really new way to do something, you're almost inevitably goring somebody else's ox. You are taking away their job, you're taking their product, and you're saying it's not relevant anymore. And so it's unsurprising, and I'll use this term again later in the presentation, that organizations do organ rejection on new ideas because it's threatening to them, and this is a huge deal. Also, there is often a lack of risk-taking appetite in successful companies. And so here's what it sounds like. Hey, we're doing pretty good, aren't we? Why are we messing around with this stuff? And so what you hear in there is that you hear this satisfaction that we are not going to take chances because what we have is good enough. And then the fact that big organizations, kind of a twin of that previous attitude, is it's slow. And here's what it sounds like. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's not move too fast here. Let's not be rash. Let's not be hasty. And all of those things, which are very logical and sometimes well-placed comments, it signals that people are slow in their decision-making, in part because they're risk averse. So because of this, companies don't typically do a great job in all types of innovation. Now, let's talk about the different types of innovation. There is incremental imitation, and this is what we see the most of. This is where products just keep getting better and better and better and better. So what you saw in smartphones, for example, is the creation of the first smartphone. That was the BlackBerry with its physical keyboard. We can argue whether or not the iPhone then was another radical or incremental innovation, or if it was the iPhone just a steady improvement of that. What you can say is a perfect example of incremental innovation is what's happened to the iPhone since the iPhone 1. It's just gotten better, 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 better. But it hasn't really changed that much. And it's to the point today where every year Apple rolls out a new iPhone and your reaction may be, what I've got's good enough. The changes aren't compelling enough to make you want to buy it. So incremental innovations are all around us, and you could name them off. One thing about incremental innovations is they're easily imitated by rivals. There's a type of innovation the textbook dropped out of this version, and I think it's to their detriment, and that's discussing process innovations. We are often focused on new products, new services, and we're not always looking about the way the company provides them. But that can be a huge source of a competitive advantage when a company figures out how to do a process that is cheaper or better for its customers. And a process innovation, I would define as one that the customer doesn't see or doesn't recognize, but it just results in things working better for them, or it takes cost out of the process. And then you have the radical innovation. These are, in fact, the huge steps. So in the transportation business, Uber, radical innovation. We're going to have people use their own cars who are not licensed taxi people and who do it part-time. Airbnb, we're not going to go to hotel chains. We're going to let individual people rent out rooms in their homes when they wish to. Again, the smartphone, clearly a radical innovation. Whether the iPhone is a radical innovation within the smartphone field, we can argue about that. But these are the big steps. Now, here's an interesting thing about a radical innovation. It almost never is suggested by a user, because users see what they have and they'll tell you what little things they want to get better, but they're not thinking big, bold, different. Radical innovations tend to come from big thoughts where people say, I can do this and people are going to love it. When Apple created iTunes to pair with its iPod, nobody was asking for iTunes, but when they saw iTunes, they went, yes, I absolutely want that. And so that's kind of the nature. Again, in radical is based on taking some inventions and making successful commercial innovations out of them. So of these types of innovations, what do big companies typically do well? They do well in incremental innovations and they do well in process innovations. But typically, startups are the ones who do well in radical innovations for the reasons we talked about on the previous slide, because you are goring people's oxes, because you're not listening to your users. You're giving something that they want or something that they're going to love, but they don't even know that they want. You don't have the internal politics of who are you're killing my product because these companies don't have any products. So these are important parts of what makes innovation. What do innovative companies typically look like? Well, they take risks, which means they have to accept failures. They're proactive, which means what? They have to be willing to gore oxes. They have to be willing to kill their own cash cows. They have to give people some autonomy. Typically, we'll talk about that more in the next video, and that means they sacrifice a little bit of control and a little bit of efficiency. And they have to be aggressive, which means that they have to stay hungry. So we'll get more into how they do the actual innovation in the next video.